Hi, my name is Lucia Mesco. I'm a student from St. Christopher's by the Sea journalism class. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me. My name is Laura Chaibongsai. I'm with Miami Waterkeeper. I'm the program director there, so I organize our junior ambassador program and our 1,000 Eyes on the Water campaign. We're trying to get the community involved in protecting our local waterways. So Miami Waterkeeper works to keep our water clean, have it be swimmable, fishable, and drinkable for everyone.
Well, have you learned anything through the experience of dealing with red tide?
Oh yeah, so there's research going on by scientists all over the world on red tide and blue-green algae and other types of algae blooms that are occurring. And so we don't know enough. We always want to keep doing more research studies to learn more. But I think the event that has been going on the last few years on the West Coast that came to Miami last year really made people here in our community start paying attention to what it is. And so a lot of people here started learning more about how it got here, why it's here. So yeah, we've been learning a lot about the movement of red tide because of that.
Is there any way we can prevent red tide?
So red tide is caused when there's a lot of an algae called Karenia brevis in the water. And like I said, the research is ongoing, but some scientists think that there's more algae growing in the water when there's really high levels of nutrients, fertilizers, sewage leaks, different things that the algae in the water will eat and then reproduce and grow more and more and more. So if we don't have all of that nutrients, all of that food that the algae eats, then, well, not eats, but uses, right? Then we won't have as much, as large of an algae bloom in any particular area. So if we can keep those levels of fertilizers and things down, we can reduce the likelihood of red tide.
Okay. What are the consequences of red tide?
So red tide, like I said, it's an algae that creates a toxin in the water. And so this toxin can kill animals in the water, but it also can negatively impact human health. So if you go to the beach when there's a red tide event going on, you might feel a tickle in your throat, you might start coughing. People experience respiratory issues, but also can become very sick from it. And so the best advice is to just avoid it when there's a red tide event going on.
Is there specific places where red tide commonly occurs?
Yes. The red tide in Florida commonly occurs on the west coast of Florida, the Gulf Coast, Sarasota, the Tampa area, Naples. So those areas are warmer than the waters over here for a lot of the year. There's not as much circulation, so the ocean isn't moving as much over there. So it creates a habitat because the red tide likes warm water, and so this area is sort of prime for it. We don't experience red tide a lot here in Miami. It's very rare. So that's why when we had the event last year, people became very nervous because our water is not normally a place where red tide can thrive.
Okay. Is there specific animals that get harmed by red tide?
Well, animals in the ocean, in these coastal areas where red tide occurs, are the first ones to experience it. So fish, that live in these coastal waters, but also marine mammals like manatees or dolphins, and then dogs and and people, right, that are close to the water, maybe go to the beach, and then they might start to feel negative impacts as well.
Yeah. What exactly is the red tide?
So red tide is the name we give to an algae bloom, the Carenia brevis dinoflagellate algae. So it's a single-celled little tiny algae plant in the water. But we call it red tide when it grows and grows and grows. And there's more and more and more in an area. And so the water starts to look red or brown. You can see it because there's so much of it in this area. And when that becomes very visible and you can see a lot of it, there's more of the toxin in the water as well. And then you start experiencing those issues with fish and human health.
How many dinoflagellates does it take to cause red tide?
I don't know if there's a specific number. I think it's when organisms start dying off because of the high concentrations. So a specific number I don't have for you, but we can certainly look it up together.
Okay. Why and how does red tide affect marine life?
So the toxin that the algae produce kill the organisms, the starting off right with smaller animals, smaller fish and things, and as the concentrations get higher, impacting organisms that are sensitive to it. So you or me walking down the street might not notice it at first, but as the concentrations get higher, we might start to feel that tickle, and eventually people who are sensitive, maybe already have asthma or other respiratory issues, they'll be the first ones to start to feel these impacts.
Oh, I think you kind of just answered this question, but are there people who are most sensitive to the toxic in red tide?
Right. So people, like I said, who have asthma or other respiratory issues already, small children and older adults that are maybe more sensitive to the toxins.
Yeah. Can people eat seafood during red tide?
It depends. So, for instance, oysters are a filter feeder. So that means they suck in water and filter out the organisms inside it. And when you have red tide, they're going to filter out the red tide. And so you don't want to eat an oyster that's full of concentrated red tide, right? So we tell people not to eat oysters when that event's going on. But if you're out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico and catching fish that are not in the direct area, it's probably safe to eat.
Okay. Are there harmful algae besides red tide? If so, can they affect Key Biscayne?
Sure. So one of the other algae blooms we like to look at is blue-green algae that is more common in the east coast of Florida. The Biscayne Bay has seen blue-green algae blooms in the past. Also areas a little bit further north of us, like I think Indian River Lagoon area. Those are different but related. So, just a different type of algae bloom.
Can we swim on the beach safely during red tide?
I wouldn't. Best to avoid it just to be safe. So you might be okay, but we recommend that people stay out of the water and don't come into contact with the water when an algae bloom is going on, when the red tide is in your area. So there's actually an app called the Swim Guide app. It's free to download, and we do weekly monitoring of beaches all across the area and upload information to that app, and it tells you which beaches are safe to swim in and which are not. So when the red tide event happened in South Florida last year, we put a special status and said, don't swim on this beach because there's a red tide event going on. And so we make sure to upload that so people know which beaches are safe and which are not.
Can red tide affect us when we are not on the beach?
Not really. People, like I said, people who are particularly sensitive might feel it a few blocks in from the water if you're walking down the street here on Key Biscayne, if there was a red tide in this area. But the further away you are from it, you wouldn't notice it as much. It also depends on how bad of a red tide event it is.
What is the difference between red tide and HAB?
So an HAB is a harmful algae bloom. And so I believe red tide is a type of harmful algae bloom, and there are others.
Okay, so how can we lessen this effect of red tide?
We can lessen the effects of red tide by making sure that, just in case it's related, and like I said, the science is still under debate on this, but a lot of scientists worry that there is a connection between fertilizers that you put on your lawn, sewage leaks, and in the water. Those things can increase the likelihood of having a red tide event. And so if we can keep those inputs into the water low, then we should hopefully start seeing less red tide events in Florida.
Is there any specific time of the year where red tide currently occurs?
Yeah. So red tide thrives on warm water. And so we usually see red tide on the Gulf of Mexico coast during the summer months. So that's been happening for a very long time. Unfortunately, it's a little bit expected and something that we see regularly. The thing that's weird is that in the last few years, we've been seeing red tide events not in the summer months and continuing into the fall and winter. And that's concerning, that these events will continue to last longer and be more frequent.
Thank you very much for being here, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me.